name's Jackie O'Reilly. I'm the president of SASE, and I'm really pleased to welcome you and to thank our fantastic team who've helped manage it and all the crew from Amsterdam. For this first session, I'm very pleased to have Professor Vera Trappmann from the University of Leeds, who was going to present the session on the Leeds Index on Labour Protest with our colleague, Professor Stuart, also from the University of Leeds, and who is co-director with myself of the Digit Centre that's run out of Leeds and Sussex University. So this is not a session where Jackie invites all her old mates to turn up to give the plenaries. There's a very good reason why I wanted to invite Vera and Mark to do this particular session, because it resonates very much with the theme of the conference about fractious connections that I'll talk about later on this afternoon. And one level on which we can measure these fractious connections is looking at the connections around work and labour, and how the labour contract establishes the legal rules of how we are connected with our employers as labourers, whether that's intellectual or manual labour. And I think what I'm going to argue in the later session is the concept of fractiousness helps us identify the nature of that connection and what is it that we are contesting in that connected relationship. And I think the work Mark, Vera and her team have been doing in Leeds is a very important contribution to international comparisons on how these nature of this contestation and the labour relationship is happening and how we can compare it globally. This work has also been taken up recently by the ILO. So basically, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Vera, and you're going to talk for about 40-ish minutes-ish, and then we'll have some questions, and due to Dutch technology, we'll be able to ask questions with these boxes that sometimes work and sometimes don't. Thank you, Vera, very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just trying, if I go a little bit further from the desk, can you still hear me well with the microphone? Does that work? Good enough? No, I have to be so close to the micro? Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great delight to be here, also on the behalf of Mark, who was... You still can't hear me well? Okay, then I have to really bend over this table. Is that better? Okay. So it's a great delight to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you about our research. Also regards from Mark, who unfortunately can't be here. He was too unwell to travel. But we have put this together. So the aims of the talk is to introduce the index that we have been recently developing, show you some of the initial results. It's still quite early, and trying to draw some initial conclusions. So the call to this year's conference, as Jackie has said, has activism and anarchy in his title, and identifies that it's something underdeveloped in the focus of SASE in the conferences in the past. So the question of where do we find resistance and activism in the world of work. So the aim of this talk now is to introduce this first attempt to map global protest in the platform economy. And this is a big team effort. We are a big team in Leeds who are doing this. So there are colleagues involved, Charles Umne, Simon Joyce, Ilya Besser and Dennis Neumann, apart from myself and Mark. And it's early stages, but not only the ILO has been interested, the E2I and other unions. So we really hope that this is a vital contribution not only to academics, but also to the world of work. So as you know, as SASE conference goers, there is a lot of emerging and burgeoning research around platform economy. It has been a focus of SASE for many years, and it has been extensively discussed in the terms of new digital technologies, subcontracting or contracting arrangements by firms, and the implications this has on the experiences for workers and consumers. And platforms are, of course, varied. So there has been much discussion about how to conceptualize their development and focus, be that in terms of the sharing economy or the collaborative economy or the platform economy. It's not the purpose of the talk today to dig into this deeper. The key focus is here on platforms-mediated paid work and the implications for those that bring that labor. Typically, this is explored in the terms of geographically tethered platforms, where the delivery of services is more local, with Uber or Deliveroo as examples, or more online and remote, like with Amazon Mechanical Turk. The literature is large and has been considered many themes in terms of the application for workers, and the starting point is often one of the disruption that we see in terms of the extent to which platforms challenge the idea of the standard employment model and the government arrangement that may exist around them. So even though there is some debate around just how extensive platform work is in terms of paid work and in the given national economy. So at the moment the share is still quite small, but the idea is that probably it's quite exemplary for what we might expect in other areas of the economy. So key themes that have been discussed so far is the kind of precarious and insecure nature of such work. And this is how I came myself to studying platforms, because when I did a project on precarious workers in European countries, I found that the only places where you actually see mobilization was the higher education system and the platform workers. But we know from research that workers themselves often see this flexibility as a kind of benefit to this work. Then there has been the question around the dependency on such work, if it is full-time, or if people are doing it as an additional income or as a supplement, or how that contributes to their kind of employment, working daily life realities. Then there has been a huge literature around the lack of social protection for the work, and at more micro level we have seen a lot of discussion around the regimes of control of this work, so the kind of algorithmic management where workers seem to be just subject to the tyranny of ratings, surveillance and performance management. The lack of social protection and job regulation and these adverse systems of control was considered to be a kind of platform for the emergence of worker grievances. And there have been studies that basically dig into how workers express their discontent. And this is what the focus will be here about. There have been initially a kind of questioning to what extent workers will actually question their working conditions, because there is no factory, the workplaces are very dispersed, and that unions might be not really prepared for this new type of work and more focused on the kind of core clientele that they, in the manufacturing and other service sectors that they defend. So there has been then a developing body of research and also increasing public attention. If you just look at the legal cases that make the news around Uber or also Deliveroo. But these initial researches, they looked at how do grievances prompt action, what are the factors that motivate workers to protest, where do they protest and how do they do it. Given the lack of formal trade union structures and legal opacity in terms of the status of being an employee or self-employed, traditional strike action doesn't seem an obvious way of contesting unrest. So the role of unions is therefore here a point of consideration, how traditional unions may or may not be able to organize, represent and mobilize those platform workers, or if we rather, as we have seen in many cases, new grassroots unions appear as an alternative because they are a bit more free of the old bureaucracies and rules that constrain more traditional unions. This research is still in developing, and most of those case studies, really good case studies, and authors of those are in here, but they are all small cases, so it's always looking at one or two countries and one sector. And we tried now to get a kind of global picture of the protest of platform workers. So how did we do this? We have created a database that documents incidents of platform worker protest globally, and we have drawn here mainly on two sources. The first is GDELT, which monitors worldwide news reports with real-time translation of online news articles in over 100 languages. And GDELT offers the search from 2017 onwards. And although GDELT is known for its machine-based event coding system, we conducted our own searches. We didn't rely on GDELT. We just use as a kind of source of material. But we have then created our own search system where we basically looked for a company and then had several keywords like protest, trade union, gig worker, resistance, a whole really long series of those. And we included China, the China Labor Bulletin, to account for protests in China, because due to press restrictions, you wouldn't nearly find anything on China in GDELT, but the colleagues in Hong Kong from the China Labor Bulletin, they do actually something similar what we do here for the platform workers, but they do it for all workers in China, that they basically mirror the Chinese internet, download it, and then they go through and try to find workers posting on social media where they are withdrawing their labor. So we focused here not on all platform work, but on 4 sectors, those where we have seen initially the most protest, which is ride-hailing, food delivery, courier services, and grocery delivery. And when we started this, we focused on global and regional players. And by global, we considered companies that had subsidiaries in 2 or more world regions. And we started with 36 companies, like in the early days, Uber Eats, Cabify, Glovo, Bolt, Foodora, Zomato, Rappi in South America, Maitoon and Didi in China, Jumia Food, Little Cap in Africa. And today we have 80 platforms in our database. So this is growing constantly because there are more and more platforms, but also because we were able to extend the search. We have then created some kind of API that helps us managing the GDELT database that reduces then basically the kind of results that we get. So up to now, when we searched for those companies, for those 80 companies, we had like 1 million research search results. And we needed to go through all of them. So we have been able to reduce this with IE to some extent. But then there was still a very considerable amount of articles that we need to sift manually and that we then code manually. And there I would like to mention all these really, really good colleagues. We had a lot of PGRs that were helping us with this coding exercise. So we had like 14 PGRs in total. And because often this work then tends to be invisibilized, but I'd like to thank them here. It was Lydia Sule, Carlos Montano Garcia, Matja Dessa, Rave Khan, Aimo Vongnul, Rinello Nafku, Rava Akora, Sarah Spence, John Musantu, Karen Bowen, Daniel Paris, Mohamed Somru, Kirill Pasevan, Neymar, and Jack Daly. So we wouldn't be able to do this without such a big team that does the coding. So for the results that I would like to present here today, we are basing this on a sample that goes from January 17 to August 2020 and covers 1,271 protests. And it's covering 60 platforms in 57 countries. And the most protest events we have seen against Uber, Deliveroo, Didi, Glovo, and Meituan. And this is how it looks geographically, if you want to get an overview where protest happens worldwide. And here I have made the attempt to dig this down just for the delivery sector in terms of companies then. And there you can see that most of the protest is actually or has been addressed against Deliveroo. So we then extrapolated a diverse set of variables from the articles. So we were looking at grievances or motivations like pay, working conditions, employment status, health and safety, running costs, deactivation, union representation, working hours. Then we looked at the type of protest and we differentiated their strikes and lock-offs, demonstrations, legal action, and institutionalization. All are quite self-evident. With institutionalization, we captured the formalization of workers' protest, such as the formation of works councils, the founding of unions, or the signing of agreements between workers and platforms. Yeah, and then we looked at the actors, and we have found traditional unions, grassroots unions, workers' collectives, and informal groups of workers, so where no organizational group was involved or no unions were involved. And by established unions, we mean those bodies that are formally recognized as part of a national trade union association and that were typically long-standing. And by grassroots, we were looking at independent unions that have been becoming significant in the platform economy. Workers' collectives, we identified workers who have identified as a kind of collective by giving themselves a name, often having a Facebook or a web page, but not being a union, so like Liefern am Limit, for example, in Germany, or Club in Paris. Honestly, the classification of the actors can be quite fuzzy sometimes, so it's a lot of work to really distinguish what type of unions we have, if we have unions in front of us, because we have been such an international team that made it a little bit easier. But let's look at the results now. So if we look at here the kind of development over time, the first result that we see is that protests have been increasing in aggregate and quite substantially. So they're almost doubled in the time that we are looking at here. This was varied by region, but notably here, I think, is the rise of the protest in Latin America in the second quarter of 2020. And I will come to that later, why that is the case. We have also variation among the sectors, with most protests going in ride-hailing and food delivery. The protests were mainly short, less than a day, and relatively small in scale. So 6 of 10 cases involved less than 100 workers, and only 14% of the protests involved. But maybe I shouldn't say only. You could look at it, even in 14% of the cases, there were more than 1,000 workers involved. So I think that is the better stress here. So although the majority is smaller in size, there are some really big protests going on. So if we look at the grievances, then this slide simply shows that pay is the dominant issue in percentages. Sometimes, and this is why it wouldn't add up here, so protests are of course motivated by a number of different grievances. But what is really notably here is that within the context of the platform literature that has stressed a lot the kind of role of algorithmic control and management, that our data shows that this is much less a cause for grievances. Health and safety, interestingly, does play a big role. And if we look at health and safety in more detail, then we do see a massive increase here in 2020, which is partly a COVID effect, and in particular in Latin America. So in countries like Argentina, this has been rising a lot. So if we dig down a little bit into the regions, then we still see that pay in all regions plays the most significant role. And so no matter at what region you look, the highest number of grievances regarding pay occur in Asia. And health and safety, that's quite interesting, is Latin America, but also Africa, where a huge share of the protests are referring to health and safety issues. So how do workers articulate their grievances, and what actions do they take? So the top three types of protest are strikes, which account for 38%, demonstrations, which account for 36%, and legal action, with 16%. And the graph then to the left drills down again into the regions, and you can see that legal action is most dominant in North America, which comes as no surprise given the high-profile legal cases in the US. An interesting result here is about who are actually driving those protests, who are the actors behind this labor unrest. And the dominant group are workers themselves, so informal gatherings, informal organization of workers. And that could be in half of all the grievances we've seen were just workers by themselves. And in other cases, it was then in coalition or with support of a union. So that in all cases involved, informal workers are almost 80%. Then the highest number are these worker collectives. So we think that is really something that needs more attention in future research, the role of those worker collectives. But unions also do play an important role. So we see that in almost a third of all protests, unions are involved. So again, in a way that will contradict what the literature was assuming, that it's too difficult for traditional unions or that they're not interested enough. Their share is actually quite high. But interestingly, the traditional and the grassroots unions rarely cooperate with each other. So if there's union support, then it's whether the one or the other. Okay. So, if we look at the role of labor actors by region, then we see that in all regions they're the dominant active group, but traditional and grassroots unions are most visible in Europe. And the workers' collectives are most visible in Latin America and in Africa. So that's really something that we should do more research about. So in our project here, then as a next step, we did binary logistic regression. And here we're just showing the significant findings. So if you look at the grievances and actors combined, then we see that traditional unions are less focused on pay, but more on unionization, employment status, and health and safety. The grassroots unions, however, are more focused on pay and unionization. The workers' collectives focus on pay and deactivation and less on employment status. And the groups of workers are predominantly concerned about pay and much less about their employment status. I think, again, a really interesting result regarding previous literatures. Looking at the form of action, maybe not surprising that traditional unions focus more on institutionalization, but also on demonstrations, but less likely on strikes. Grassroots unions' preferred choice are demonstrations, workers' collectives, the institutionalization, so they were often then establishing a new union, and the groups of workers would go for strikes and lock-offs and demonstrations, but less likely for institutionalization or for legal action. So if we try to bring this all together to identify categorizations of labor protest, there are then 3 different factors which we combine to distinctive patterns of protest. And we have adopted here Silver's historical approach, differentiating between Marx type and Polanyi types of labor unrest. So, and by Marx type labor unrest, we understand here worker struggles to increase their share of the surplus value, while Polanyi type protest would be attempts of workers to limit the commodification and market competition. And both types are evident in our data set, with the Marx type being much dominant. So almost half of the cases here that we see are some kind of Marx type protest, 20% are Polanyi type protest, and the rest didn't really fall into one of the models. So we did model this in a more formal sense, and we have found that these 2 labor types of unrest can be derived from the motivations and then mapped on actors and types of actions. And we first did it conceptually by hand, and then we did an exploratory factor analysis, where we were then mapping the Marxist and Polanyian type, how it associates in terms of the protest form and the different actors. And the factor analysis confirmed our idea. So what becomes what comes out of the data here is that the Marx type protest is positively associated with strikes and lock-offs, demonstrations and grassroots unions, workers' collectives, and informal groups of workers, and mainly in the courier sector. The Polanyi type protest was positively associated with legal action, mainstream unions, and more in Europe and North America, and more with ride-hailing. So that is kind of a very quick summary. We've submitted a paper on this, so hopefully there will be soon more to read about this and in more detail how we did it. So for now, I think I can come already to my conclusions. We think that the Leeds Index offers a really good new tool to document labor unrest globally. And with the pandemic, we have seen an explosion of protests in so many different economic sectors. But we clearly see here a temporary dimension, a development over time. Pay was the most dominant grievances. So we see a lot of Marx-type labor unrest. And this is also very interesting in terms of further conclusions. So does the platform economy really present a kind of different type of work where we do see different types of actions, more difficulties in disrupting more problems in affecting the kind of labor-capital relation. And in a way, we see here with our quantitative data set some kind of continuation what we see in non-platform work. What we have not done yet, what we want to do in the future, is to look at the outcomes of those disputes. So at the moment, we don't know which of those protest events had any effect or were in any kind successful. And this will then lead to the broader question, do those protests change the forms of employment relations? So this is an example of what we have started doing, but we're not yet there. So where you then look into different events and they basically can be grouped into one dispute. So often those events are happening in different cities, but are really addressing the same problems against the same company, that we would call then a dispute. And you then basically have to go in each dispute and look, what was the outcome? Did it have any kind of outcome, yes or no? If there was an outcome, did it lead to accommodating the demands, or did it lead to a kind of power increase, or did it lead to more unionization? So what comes next for us? So as I said, we have just done 4 sectors within the platform economy. We would really like to enlarge that data set, so to include cleaning, sex work, and other platform works. But we would also like to go into the kind of protest that we see by online workers. It's much more difficult to capture you, so it's much harder to find any kind of news articles on those type of protests. It's organized differently. So if you think at the Fair Work project that IG Metall was putting on, so where then online workers could basically value and grade employers. So this will need a kind of different methodological approach to be able to also include online work. But this is something that we want to do. One way of doing it will also opening up the database for crowdsourcing. So it would be really good if you have a look at our database and you see cases that you know of which have not been covered, if you just help populating this database. And we have done some work where we looked at protests in other sectors. So the ILO was particularly interested in the kind of protest mapping that we did for the platform economy, that they asked us to look into other sectors as well. So we have done it now for retail and healthcare. And you can see here as well that there is a huge increase over the pandemic in terms of protests. And that there is a sheer huge amount of protests, and we are currently updating this database. So this stops in May 2021. We are doing it until the end of 2021, and there we see already a much more increase in terms of protests. So at the end of the year, it's double the size as what it was in the on average than it was a year before. So that gives really interesting questions around to what extent did the pandemic function as a kind of driver for workers considering their rights, reconsidering the conditions under which they work. So it could be that the pandemic here worked as an accelerator of protest, and that we might see more changes in terms of employment relations. Just to give you an idea, so here we see again Argentina was very active, so we have seen a lot of healthcare workers on the streets in Argentina. France was the country with most protests. So just in this 15 months that we have covered here, there were 442 protests by healthcare workers in France. And again, I'm not presenting these results here, but it's really interesting that again, pay did play a huge role. So it was not only about PPE, it was also about PPE, but the most dominant grievances was again pay. So I think that's really interesting that there's also some kind of consciousness building going on under what conditions, for what kind of outcome, for what kind of income do you actually do your work. So then we have, that's still in the making, so we have are in train of building a website, and we are pretty much inspired by the China Labor Bulletin, where they offer, and this is what we will do as well, where we offer an interface where you can search in our database so that you can go in and look, oh, what actually did happen in my country against which platform company. If you are interested, we're going to hold a launch event for the website and for this tool that we really want to make public and make it useful for other academics, but also for trade unions and policymakers. If you want to be invited to the launch event, please get in touch. And as soon as the website is online, there will be also its own email address that you then can use. So it will involve an interface for this crowdsourcing, so that then really labor activists can send us details about events that we haven't covered, or that they can confirm data. Sometimes. So for every event that we have, we read like numerous articles, and each article gives you other bits of information about a protest event. So then that could be also a kind of tool for proof testing how good it works. So, and just in time, we have set up a Twitter account, so you can also follow the Leeds Index project on Twitter if you want to be updated on future publications. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Vera. I thought that was excellent. I haven't actually heard those results yet myself, even though we're in the same centre, so it really is fresh, hot off the press. So now we want to open it up for questions and answers. Would anybody like to volunteer to help me throw these around the room, please? Put your hands up. So if anybody's any questions they'd like to ask Vera, we can do that now. Okay, apparently, according to UAV, you have to hold it a bit like that. Do you want to introduce yourself and say what your name is?
Hi, I'm Simon Schaub from the University of Basel. I found that presentation really interesting. And I have one question regarding the types of protest events. So clearly relying on media reports limits the kinds of protests that you can take into account, right? And I think this is very, very interesting from the side of the results, but from my research in the gig economy, there's a lot going on that is kind of hidden under the surface, and that obviously isn't covered here, and that might also change the issues that are at stake. Because, for example, regarding issues with algorithmic management and the technology, many of the protests are kind of just sabotage or manipulation, which wouldn't go into press, so that wouldn't only change the types of action, but also the issues would maybe be touched by that. Could you comment on that? I would be very interested in what you think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, here. This is here. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Rajesh Rajshekar, Bangalore University, India. A wonderful presentation and good analysis. But what you mentioned about the kind of unrest that you are looking at, the parameters are the visible or the manifested unrest. But there are aspects which are not manifested, there are certain hidden, latent aspects which could be more than the economic and livelihood issues. It could be more of behavioral aspects. The whole gig economy or the platform economy you're talking about is not working with the machines, but you're working with the people. You're connecting with the people. The connectivity has some behavioral issues. And that is where new problems emerge. They germinate. And probably that is brewing. And we are not looking into those things. And the kind of research, unfortunately, the social sciences, we are doing it in terms of all the research is post-mortem. After the event takes place, we try to dissect and again try to analyze what has happened. But in most of the cases, we need to go deeper into those aspects where these kind of issues are germinating, and they are basically behavioral aspects and nothing to do with the livelihood and various other things. Because most of the cases where the livelihood and the payment issues you are talking about, those issues, even if they are normalized, people are unhappy with the behavior of the customers and the management both ways. And that is creating a lot of problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice provocative questions on research methodology. And the last question in that session is a man with a red box.
Yep.
Answer them.
Thanks. I'm Mark Cassell. I'm from Kent State University in Ohio. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to looking at the website when it's up. I did have sort of a similar methodological question, and I'm wondering, you're looking at media accounts, and I mean, obviously, in the United States, for example, there's the National Labor Relations Board that has cases that they publish every year. That's made available that gives you at least a sense of the kind of protest you mentioned in North America, that a big part of the protests involve legal action. I guess I'm wondering if you've thought about somehow looking at these sort of formal protests through agencies like the NLRB to measure the degree of labor protestation and union activization. Thanks.
Do you want to go ahead and answer?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. That's really good. Yes, so the methodology. We have spent weeks discussing and probing the methodology. So I think my first answer is, so this is quantitative research. So what you were saying in terms of there's a lot of the things that maybe we don't know about yet, and they only come to the fore later. I think this is what qualitative research is really good about, to detect those new tendencies, new grievances, and I myself am a qualitative researcher. I would never underestimate the value that we have from this qualitative or ethnographic research. Here, the aim was to offer a picture that goes beyond the single case studies that we have. And we had a lot of kind of, there is the event protest analysis that is well established in the social sciences, and they rely on news media anyway. So, but now with the kind of question, do we get actually everything covered that goes on with platform workers? So we have already said this is mainly for gig work, because it will be so much more difficult to cover it for online work. Did we cover everything in terms of the gig work? So we did do a kind of test for the UK, where we were all really good experts and would say we were well connected to labor activists. We had a good overview. We had an own created database that came from activists' mailing lists, from social media accounts, and we basically tested what do we find with GDELT. Does GDELT find everything that was in our kind of own created database? And it did. So that was a really good proof. Then I would say, in terms of, yes, there are ways of disrupting the labor process that might not have a news article about, but if the same workers then go on a demonstration to talk about what is really shit at work, I'm pretty sure they would mention that as well, that they are also unhappy about the algorithm. But if it wasn't in the article, then it wasn't coded. So I think that is also some kind of control. And of course, yeah, so this is why the floor is open and the door is open, that we would like to have a lot of this discussion and contributions from labor activist groups themselves. We hold a workshop 2 years ago where we invited labor activists, and for the launch we really would like to have as many labor activists from the world, around the world, as possible. The third question, yes, I think so this is really just the start, yeah? So we in the future, we would like to include other sources as well. So have a kind of scraping of Twitter feeds, go through more institutionalized ways. Legal case it will be the most easiest way to find out about the outcomes, because that will be public. You're absolutely right. That will make it a bit easier. But then also we would like to bring in other variables that are more linked to the kind of context and the kind of institutions in a country. So what is the labor regulation looking like in each country, to explain some of the patterns that we see, and can make more casual, more causal statements about the protests that we see.
Good. I have 3 more questions. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You've got to hold it up straight and like that.
Like that? Okay. Okay. I'm Eleni Papagiannaki from Birmingham City University. I'm a labor economist, and this is what the labor economists can dream of. That's an excellent initiative you take. Well done. I like the distinction you made between Marx type and Polanyi type of mobilization and kind of workers group. I know it's early days, but do you have any evidence so far that these worker collectives or new unions eventually join traditional, larger unions, syndicates, or even political parties? I understand because each country is different. The organized workers are doing it differently. That's all.
Hi, I'm Philip Riederle from the Oxford Internet Institute. Thank you, that was very fascinating. Am I off? Yeah, there I am. I think that I simply try to speak loud, so that's a very valuable and rich thing. Yeah, so collective action usually requires some preconditions or commitment to emerge. So, but gig platforms stress their flexibility and, well, non-committal character. So I wonder what makes people stay and protest instead of simply jumping off or trying to find a job in a traditional employment setting. So are there maybe any structural factors at play in terms of who participates in these protests? Is it the people's situation, seeing this as their main employment or as a side hustle? Or is it maybe also dependent on the form of employment? Are the workers engaging in these protests self-employed versus actually employed by these platforms?
Great question. And the very last one in this round of 3. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. This is Lin Tang from the University of Bonn. And thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I just have a really simple question. So is the Leeds index database free or not? Thank you very much.
No, in charge.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. So the coalition between unions and other actors, or do workers then actually join unions? So we haven't done this over time to see when did a workers' collective then cooperated with a union, but we can say that the kind of total numbers. So there are in something like so in around 6 to 7%, unions act on their own without an informal group of workers, and in roundabout, so they make 30% union actions in total. So that is, so then around about in 8% of the cases, they actually do have coalitions with workers collectives or that they work together with informal group of workers. So there is and this is an important, I think, political finding, that there is a lot of involvement of the unions, and that while we can see it's a kind of bottom-up movement, yeah, so there is a lot of protest that comes from the workers themselves. There is a lot of institutionalization happening, that workers create unions, new unions, or that they see coalitions. If I had time, I have actually a slide with all the coalitions. I could put this on, but probably time is not enough. But I can put it on Twitter. Then you can see that. Yeah, who protests? I can't answer this on the basis of this data set, because you will have you sometimes can gauge from the articles how many participated. You can see you can detect from photos a little bit like we tried, at least, if we can see any kind of gender. Do we have female spokespersons? But we don't know much more about the participants. This is something that you know from the qualitative research, who protests and why do they stick on. And I would say that's a really interesting divide between, I mean, the fluctuation among platform workers is very high. And then that was also often assumed that this is a kind of hindrance to collective action. But there are kind of different groups of workers who organize the protest, and it's those who are actually dependent on the work, but there's also a group of workers who are, especially in the couriers, who are passionate about what they do, so they mainly don't do it for the money, but it's a good additional income, and they love cycling. And they kind of have a really pride in how they are treated as cyclists, and they would then also organize in order to get fair conditions and be treated with respect. That's another group. And then there's a new interesting development. If you look at the really institutionalized German employment relations, that it's now a large group of migrant workers who is actually coming with very different type of approaches to challenge Lieferando or Gorilla, and where the unions at the moment don't know yet what they're going to do with this group of workers. So there's a new emerging, really big force for organization and struggle. Is it free? Yes, it's free. But so once the web page is published, you will be able and go and search in the database. But probably we will let you know. So what companies protest, where is it happening, when did it happen? But I think we're going to publish a couple of papers first before we open it up entirely.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, can I say a massive thank you to Vera? Yeah. I'm really delighted with this session because actually I hadn't seen the results before, and I think it really hits on a theme of how do we get new empirical evidence to measure some of the things that are developing in our societies and economies, and what kind of concepts can we use to try and understand them? Are the old ones helpful, or do we need to introduce new ones? That's part of what the whole conference is about. So thank you for kicking us off on this discovery, and have a nice cup of coffee, and see you later for those coming back. Bye. Welcome. That was really good.